left Dan rather stunned on live television. Under the blazing lights of a nationwide broadcast, she stared directly at a journalism legend and exposed the painful failures of the press without blinking. Millions watched as she delivered a single sentence that shook the very foundations of American media. What happens when one woman dares to confront the old guardians and refuses to back down? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The floodlights bathed the set of America at the crossroads in a cold, clinical glare, making every breath visible, every glance electric. The network had billed it as a clash of eras, but no one in the control room could predict just how volatile the collision would be. At center stage, Dan Rather emerged from the shadows, his figure erect, his silver hair catching the light like a crown. He moved like a monarch in exile, still exuding the gravity of a bygone age. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, sharp and still, her tailored navy suit cutting through the sterile air like a blade. Her eyes, dark and steady, locked onto Rather's with a quiet fury, as if daring him to underestimate her, to mistake her youth for weakness. The two figures framed against the massive backdrop of an American flag seemed almost mythic, like warriors summoned by history itself to settle an old unspoken debt. In the control booth, a producer whispered, "Go live in 3 is 2." But it was already too late. The tension had taken on a life of its own, stretching through the cables, the walls, the millions of television screens now flickering to life across the nation. This wasn't just a political debate. This was a crucible where old power would be forced to answer to new truth. And Jasmine Crockett, armed with history, anger, and impossible poise, was ready to ignite it. As the last echoes of the opening fanfare faded into a silence sharp enough to cut glass, Dan Rather leaned forward slightly, the weight of decades behind him, and prepared to strike the first blow. With a slow, deliberate motion, he adjusted the stack of crisp notes before him. Notes he barely needed but kept anyway. A relic of an era where preparation was armor and performance was warfare. The cameras caught the subtle shift in his posture, the tightening of his jawline, the narrowing of his eyes into slits of polished steel. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable cadence of authority sharpened over half a century. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, his tone deceptively polite, almost grandfatherly. "There are those who believe that matters as grave as judicial reform demand more than conviction. They require seasoned judgment, tempered insight, hard-earned experience." The words floated in the air, coated in a sheen of respect, but weighted with dismissal. He didn't have to say it outright. The accusation was baked into every syllable. "You haven't earned your place here." Rather's hand tapped a slow, methodical beat against the oak table, the sound unnervingly loud in the studio's engineered silence. He smiled thinly, a flash of teeth more chilling than friendly. "Given your relatively brief tenure on the national stage," he pressed on, emphasizing each word like a hammer driving a nail, "how would you answer those critics who wonder whether you truly comprehend the gravity of the systems you wish to reform? Or if perhaps," he paused, letting the insult linger like smoke, "youthful passion has led you dangerously close to naivety." The camera zoomed tighter, catching the flicker, so slight it was almost invisible, of Jasmine's left hand clenching once beneath the desk. Her eyes never wavered from his, dark and unblinking, like a fighter absorbing the first hit without flinching. But the blow was real. In front of millions watching live, Dan Rather hadn't just questioned her proposals. He had questioned her right to even sit at the table. Around them, the vast, gleaming studio felt smaller, hotter, every microphone and camera lens pulling closer, as if America itself leaned in, hungry to see whether the young congresswoman would crumble under the weight of a legend's carefully honed contempt. Rather, sensing the first cut had drawn blood, pressed his advantage like a seasoned warrior who knew that mercy was a weakness and momentum was everything. He shifted slightly in his chair, rolling his shoulders back, settling into the rhythm of an old familiar battle. His voice dipped lower, slower, the kind that demanded you listen not out of fear, but because it wore the armor of history itself. "You know," he began, his tone almost reflective, like he was letting Jasmine in on some private lesson, When I started in this business, truth wasn't just something you said, it was something you lived, something you fought for, something you gave up a lot to protect. His words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate, each one chosen like a stone carefully placed on a fragile glass table. I filed stories from jungles, deserts, riots, places where if you got the facts wrong, people didn't just get mad, people died. This wasn't about chasing attention. It was about getting it right. He let that line settle, a silent accusation shimmering between them. Then, with a slow breath that seemed to draw in the entire studio's stale, nervous air, he pressed forward. There was a code, he said, tapping two fingers lightly against his chest. An understanding between reporters and the public. You had one job, get it right. Tell the truth, even when it was hard, even when nobody wanted to hear it. His eyes found Jasmine's across the gulf of the studio lights, and for a moment, the years between them seemed to stretch wider than oceans. His gaze was not angry, it was worse, it was disappointed. The look of a man who believed he was witnessing the crumbling of a cathedral he had spent his life building, stone by bloody stone. You see, Congresswoman, he continued, his voice soft but sharp enough to cut, we didn't earn our seats in places like this by shouting louder than everyone else. We earned them by showing, again and again, that we could carry the weight that came with telling the truth. He paused, letting the words settle until the silence itself seemed to accuse her. And sometimes, he added, voice even lower, I wonder if your generation even knows what that weight feels like anymore. His words weren't questions. They were verdicts. And as he finished, Dan rather leaned back ever so slightly, his face set not in triumph, but in sadness, as if the battle in his mind had already been won. Around them, the air was thick with a quiet, biting unfairness. Because what he demanded was not just respect for the craft. He demanded deference to an era that no longer existed, and a burden Jasmine had never been allowed to share. In that cold, merciless light, she was not judged by her ideas or her courage, but by the centuries of tradition she had been born too late to inherit. The weight of his judgment still hung heavy in the air, but Jasmine didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't even blink, as if she had already prepared her soul for battles exactly like this. The studio lights bore down on her, hot and merciless, but she stayed carved out of steel, untouched. For a long moment, the only movement was Dan Rather himself, shifting slightly, eyes narrowing, searching desperately for a crack in the fortress before him. There was none. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to shout. She didn't need to defend herself. Her silence was the answer. Jasmine didn't rush. She didn't fidget or force a nervous smile. She understood something most people never learn. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. She let the silence expand until it wasn't just uncomfortable. It was unbearable, like a truth everyone knew, but was too afraid to name. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to defend herself like a child called to the principal's office. She let the injustice hang there in front of everyone, raw and exposed, daring them all to see it for what it was. In those seconds, Jasmine seized control of the room without lifting a single finger. And when she finally spoke, her voice didn't tremble. It didn't rise in anger. It didn't crack under the weight placed on her shoulders. Instead, it came out low, steady, and razor-sharp, slicing straight through the heavy air. Her eyes locked on Rather's, calm but unyielding, as she said very simply, experience doesn't always mean you were right. The words were clean, clear, and devastating. Not a scream, not a defense, but a fact laid bare on the table between them. And for the first time that night, it was not Jasmine who looked small beneath the lights. It was the weight of the old world, sagging under the truth she had just spoken aloud. Rather, stung by her calm defiance, didn't retreat. Instead, he doubled down, sharpening his words into weapons meant to cut deeper where silence had failed. Dan Rather leaned slightly forward again, his hands clasped tightly on the table, his voice losing its grandfatherly warmth and gaining the sharper edge of a prosecutor sensing an opportunity. We live in a time, he said, slow and heavy, where outrage travels faster than facts, where being loud is often mistaken for being right. He let the words hang for just a beat, then drove them harder. We've seen it. Networks that once stood for truth now chasing ratings. Stories rushed out without verification. Headlines designed to provoke, not to inform. His tone wasn't angry. It was weary, full of the righteous exhaustion of someone who believed he had watched the house he built burn down, one careless match at a time. "You are part of a generation," he continued, his gaze drilling into Jasmine with almost clinical precision, "that sometimes mistakes noise for knowledge, volume for value, passion for principle." Every word was chosen to sting, to paint her not as a serious reformer, but as another product of a culture he despised. The injustice of it crackled in the air, because the attack wasn't on her ideas. It was on her very right to speak them at all. And as the cameras inched even closer, the audience could almost feel it. Rather wasn't just arguing anymore. He was trying to bury her. Seeing the blow had landed, or at least unsettled the ground beneath her, Rather pressed once more, aiming not just at Jasmine, but at the entire world he believed had cheapened the meaning of truth. He straightened in his chair, slow and deliberate, smoothing a hand across his tie in a gesture that was more ritual than necessity. His voice dropped slightly, almost conspiratorial, as if he were sharing an uncomfortable truth with an old friend who had lost their way. "We live in the TikTok era now," Rather said. Every word weighted, every syllable a small stone thrown at glass, where 15 seconds of outrage earns more attention than 15 years of real work. He paused, not because he needed the breath, but because he wanted the silence to frame the insult perfectly, like a dagger displayed in a velvet case. His smile was thin, stretched tight across a face built from decades of disappointment, and it didn't reach his eyes. Headlines have become hashtags. Stories have been replaced with slogans. Noise has been mistaken for knowledge. Each word fell heavy, one after another, like the slow, certain swing of a hammer meant to drive a nail deep and permanent. "But truth," he said, tapping the table once with his knuckles, sharp and loud, "truth doesn't come in sound bites. Truth doesn't trend. And truth," he added, locking his gaze onto Jasmine's without blinking, "doesn't beg for attention." For a split second, it felt like the tide might turn, that maybe, just maybe, the world would choose the comfort of an old myth over the hard edge of a new truth. He didn't call her name. He didn't need to. The accusation was clear enough. "You are what's wrong with the new world." Around them, the studio was so silent, it was almost painful. No shuffling papers, no coughs from the crew, no whispered directions from the producer's booth. It was as if the whole building was holding its breath, terrified that even the smallest sound would tip the balance and cause the whole moment to explode. For one heartbeat, for one terrible second, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just facing Dan Rather. She was facing every doubt, every old voice that had ever whispered she didn't belong, and millions of strangers were watching to see what she would do next. For a moment, it looked as if Jasmine might break under the weight of it, but then, with a calmness so sharp it almost seemed cruel, she did something no one expected. She smiled. It wasn't a smirk. It wasn't defiant or flashy. It was something quieter and far more dangerous. A small, slow curl at the corner of her mouth that spoke of something old and heavy inside her. Something forged from too many moments just like this one. She let the smile live in the silence, stretching the seconds until the air between them felt brittle, ready to snap. The cameras caught it. The millions watching at home saw it too. In that simple, almost imperceptible smile, Jasmine Crockett did what words could never fully do. She took the power back without moving a muscle. Then, without changing the steady rhythm of her breathing, she spoke. Her voice was low, even, unhurried. The kind of voice that forced you to lean in, to really listen, because it wasn't fighting for your attention. It already owned it. "It's true," she said, her tone respectful, but edged with something colder, sharper. "Truth doesn't trend. It doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't need a spotlight to exist." She let those words sink deep into the room, her eyes locked on Rather's, not in anger but in certainty, as if she were stating the weather, not picking a fight. Then she tilted her head just slightly, almost curiously, and her voice softened even more, which somehow made what came next hit twice as hard. But sometimes, she continued, pausing just long enough for the anticipation to bite, even the people who spent their lives chasing truth forgot how to carry it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She let the accusation float there, naked and undeniable, in the hot, humming air of the studio. She watched him feel it, watched it land. And then, in a voice that was barely louder than a whisper but somehow filled the entire room, she said 5 words that cracked the floor beneath them both. "America still remembers Rathergate, sir." The name alone, Rathergate, ripped open old wounds that neither time nor pride had fully healed, and Jasmine, without raising her voice, pulled the curtain all the way back. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She spoke slowly, with the kind of steady, cutting calm that forced every ear in the room to listen. "Rathergate wasn't just a scandal," Jasmine said, her gaze locked unblinking on Dan Rather. "It was a betrayal. In 2004, you stood in front of millions of Americans and delivered a story that wasn't true, claiming President George W. Bush had dodged military service based on documents that turned out to be fake." She let that sink in for a moment, then went on, her voice even lower, more direct. "It wasn't a small mistake. It was a massive breach of trust. And you weren't just any reporter. You were the face of American news, the man people counted on to tell them what was real." She leaned in just slightly, as if pulling him closer into the undeniable weight of the truth. "When that story fell apart, it wasn't just your reputation that took the hit. It was the faith of an entire country in the press itself." Her words slowed further, everyone hitting like a hammer driving a nail. For years after that, Americans didn't look at the news and see guardians of truth anymore. They saw men who could be fooled, or worse, men who could fool them. She let a final breath of silence fill the studio before finishing, soft but merciless. "You became the living proof of how easily trust could be broken." The silence after her words was heavier than anything spoken. But Jasmine wasn't finished, and what she said next shattered the last illusions hanging in the air. She sat a little straighter, the quiet confidence radiating off her like heat from a flame that refused to die. Her voice didn't rise, but somehow it filled every inch of the room. "It wasn't my generation that weakened the truth," Jasmine said, each word deliberate, each syllable slicing clean through the heavy air. She paused just long enough to make sure everyone heard it, felt it, lived it. "It was yours," she continued, her eyes never leaving Rather's, "that let it bleed." The words didn't explode. They detonated slowly, sinking into the walls, the cameras, the very breath of the room. For a long heartbeat, there was nothing but a stunned, frozen stillness, like the air itself was too afraid to move. And then it hit. A low, rolling sound at first, gasps, sharp intakes of breath, a rumble of voices that grew and grew until it felt like the walls themselves might crack. Some of the crew shifted awkwardly behind the cameras. A producer in the control room was seen standing up, hands pressed against his headset, shouting silent commands that no one could hear over the growing chaos. The audience was no better, some stunned into wide-eyed silence, others whispering fiercely, a few even clapping before stopping themselves, as if they too were unsure whether they had just witnessed courage or sacrilege. It wasn't just disruption. It was the sound of a boundary breaking, a truth finally spoken aloud in a room built to pretend it didn't exist. The moderator, face pale and stiff, scrambled to regain control, his voice cutting sharply through the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, please, let's maintain order," he barked, tapping his papers against the desk like a gavel in a courtroom that no longer believed in rules. But the spell of ceremony was broken. Jasmine's words still hung there, alive and defiant, refusing to be smothered. Across the country, millions sat frozen in front of their screens, knowing without a shadow of a doubt that they had just seen the moment when everything changed, and there was no going back. As the noise finally ebbed, a deeper silence took its place, one not of respect, but of expectation, and all eyes turned back to Dan Rather, waiting to see if the legend could withstand the weight of his own past. For a moment he stayed still, as if the force of Jasmine's words had physically pressed him into the leather of his chair. Then he moved too fast, too tight, A small adjustment of his tie, a clearing of his throat that echoed louder than intended. The cracks were small but unmistakable, and in a room trained to notice weakness, they were deafening. His voice, when it came, lacked its usual iron. It was, it was a professional lapse, he said, his words stumbling out in fits. Too polished, yet too desperate, like a man trying to read a prepared statement from a script that no longer made sense. It wasn't intentional. It was an error in judgment, nothing more. But no matter how carefully he spoke, the room had already changed. His excuses, once enough to command understanding or pity, now fell flat, hitting the floor like broken glass no one bothered to sweep up. The energy in the studio shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. The unspoken contract between legend and audience, the quiet agreement to forgive his age, his mistakes, his humanity, had dissolved into something colder, harder. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment, sharp and final. A collective sense that the man before them was no longer untouchable, that even the mighty could falter when forced to face their own reflection. The cameras caught it all. The way Dan Rather's shoulders sagged just slightly, the way he blinked too often, the way his gaze dropped for half a heartbeat before snapping back up in a weak attempt at defiance. And then they shifted, slow and deliberate, toward Jasmine Crockett. She didn't move. She didn't react. She sat there like a still flame, burning quietly, refusing to flicker. Her face was unreadable, her hands steady in her lap, her body language saying without a single word, "I didn't have to destroy you. You did it yourself." And across the country, across the television screens and glowing devices of millions, people saw it happen in real time. The passing of a moment, the collapse of an illusion, the rising of a new force that didn't need to shout to be heard. And in the heavy waiting silence that followed, Jasmine didn't gloat, didn't rush. She simply rose into the space left open before her, carrying the weight of 1,000 unsaid truths. She sat perfectly still for a heartbeat longer, letting the moment thicken until it felt almost unbearable. The lights above her were hot and harsh, the cameras hovered like silent judges, and the millions watching at home leaned closer to their screens, barely breathing. But Jasmine was steady, grounded, untouched by the chaos she had stirred. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, was low and clear, not loud, not trembling, but filled with a force that made every syllable land like a fist against a locked door. "The truth," she said, each word sharp enough to draw blood, "doesn't need permission." She paused, letting the sentence hang in the air, daring anyone to challenge it. Her gaze didn't flicker to the moderator, to the audience, or even to Dan Rather. She stayed rooted, unwavering, speaking as if she were carving the words directly into the stone walls around her. "It just needs to be spoken," she added, her voice dropping slightly lower, almost intimate now, so calm it became undeniable. The tension was so thick it was almost physical. People in the studio visibly stiffened, feeling the ground shifting beneath them, but powerless to stop it. Slowly, purposefully, Jasmine turned toward the nearest camera, the red light glowing like a living eye, and locked eyes with the nation. She didn't blink. She didn't soften. She held the lens the way a soldier holds a battle line. "And if the truth makes someone uncomfortable," she said, her tone even sharper now, slicing clean through the brittle silence, "maybe they should ask themselves why." She didn't smile after she spoke. She didn't look away. She simply let the words sit there, burning hotter with every second of silence that followed. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't arrogance. It was something rarer, something harder. It was the certainty of a person who knew that speaking the truth, especially when it hurt, wasn't just a right. It was a duty. As Jasmine's final words echoed into the silence, the cameras stayed frozen on her face. But outside that studio, the real storm had already begun. It started as a spark, a single tweet, a clipped video, no longer than 15 seconds. But in seconds, it was everywhere. Within the first minute, hashtags like Crockett and Rather, Truth Without Permission, and the New Voice of America began climbing the trending charts with a speed that made even seasoned media veterans blink in disbelief. On Twitter, the clip of Jasmine looking straight into the camera and speaking her final line detonated like a bomb. People didn't just share it, They reacted to it as if they had been waiting years, decades, for someone to finally say what she had said. Accounts that usually argued across political lines, progressive activists, military veterans, even disillusioned former journalists, found themselves retweeting the same moment, adding captions like, "This is not a soundbite. This is history." Some framed her words in bold black text over the American flag. Others slowed the footage down, adding orchestral music behind her calm, devastating delivery, turning it into something almost mythic, almost larger than life. In less than 5 minutes, the video had been shared over 100,000 times. In less than 10, it had crossed 1 million. News outlets scrambled to catch up. MSNBC broke into programming with a live panel, the anchor wide-eyed as she replayed the footage. This is one of those rare moments," she said, almost whispering, as if afraid to break the gravity of what had just unfolded. Over at Fox News, the mood was more combative. Clips of Jasmine's line were framed between banners screaming, "Disrespecting journalistic legends," and "A new low" or "A necessary truth." But even their host couldn't deny the impact. One grizzled commentator, trying and failing to hide the grudging respect in his voice, muttered on live air, "Well, she didn't miss. That's for damn sure." On TikTok, a different kind of storm exploded. Thousands of young creators, many of whom had never stayed tuned to a congressional hearing or a primetime political show in their lives, seized the clip and made it their own. Some added pounding hip-hop beats behind Jasmine's final stare into the camera. Others stitched her words into videos of protest marches, courtroom dramas, slow-motion shots of broken glass reforming. "She spoke for all of us," one caption read. "The ones who were told to wait their turn. The ones who were told to shut up and let the old world keep bleeding." Within 30 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had gone from respected congresswoman to full-blown cultural symbol. CNN flashed breaking banners. "Crockett calls out, rather a new era of accountability." The New York Times, notoriously slow to react to viral moments, posted an early digital headline before the hour closed. "Truth doesn't need permission. How Jasmine Crockett redrew the lines of political discourse." Within an hour, Rolling Stone had already called it the Jasmine Crockett moment. But the most telling sign wasn't just in headlines or trending charts. It was in the faces of those old enough to know what it meant. Journalists who had spent their lives defending a broken system now sat in newsrooms, staring at muted televisions, their faces pale, their hands motionless on keyboards. They understood before anyone else that something bigger than a scandal or a viral moment had happened. They understood that Jasmine hadn't just won an argument. She had pulled the curtain back on decades of quiet compromises, unspoken bargains, and comfortable lies. And she had done it without raising her voice. In Washington, D.C., power brokers scrambled to measure the damage. Staffers in the Capitol building forwarded clips of the moment to chiefs of staff, to political consultants, to major donors with subject lines like urgent. "You need to see this." Some saw opportunity, others saw a threat, but no one, not even the bitterest cynics, dared call it a mistake. Meanwhile, on Reddit, a flood of memes was already underway. Someone posted a split screen. On one side, a black and white photo of Dan Rather in his prime, microphone in hand, standing firm during Hurricane Carla. On the other side, a color photo of Jasmine, sitting calm and unyielding under the studio lights, staring into the camera with the world on fire behind her. Caption, "The old storm, the new storm." Other memes were crueler, painting Rather as the fading emperor, the man who demanded loyalty from a system he himself had helped break. But amid the jokes and the celebration, there was something deeper, something electric, an overwhelming sense that something had shifted, not just in that studio, but in the country itself. And yet, through all of it, Jasmine Crockett said nothing more. She didn't tweet. She didn't post a statement. She didn't launch a campaign fundraiser. She let the truth she had spoken live on its own, without the desperate need to spin it, to package it, to make it palatable. In a world obsessed with rebranding moments into marketing slogans, her silence was deafening, and it made her victory even louder. Back inside the studio, the moderators and producers tried to regain control of the program. They tried to move on, to pivot to safer ground, to recapture the scripted flow of the night. But it was useless. The energy had shifted. The room itself felt heavier, thicker, like the walls were bearing witness to something they weren't built to contain. And at the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still, calm as a storm waiting for the next wave to come. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't demanded the spotlight. She hadn't asked for permission. She had simply told the truth, and the world had no choice now but to reckon with it. Across America, from crowded bars to quiet living rooms, people stared at their screens, silent, blinking, feeling something they couldn't quite name settle heavy in their chests. It wasn't outrage. It wasn't inspiration. It was something rarer, something raw. The realization that sometimes real change doesn't arrive with a roar. Sometimes it comes in the form of a woman sitting quietly under hot lights, daring to tell the truth no one else would. And once heard, it could not be unheard. Once seen, it could not be unseen. The fire had been lit, and it wasn't going out anytime soon. But as the footage burned its way across every screen in America, something deeper began to break open. Not just outrage or admiration, but a full-scale war over what Jasmine's moment really meant. Within hours, the battle lines had been drawn, not with guns or banners, but with opinion pieces, cable news panels, and furious threads across every corner of the internet. On one side stood the old guard, the traditionalists, the veterans of journalism and politics who had built their careers on the rules Jasmine had so effortlessly shattered. They took to the airwaves, their voices thick with outrage masked as concern. "What she did was reckless," barked one former editor-in-chief on a primetime panel, his fist clenching on the table. "She humiliated a man who spent his life defending the truth." Another commentator shook his head solemnly, as if grieving a lost era. "There's a reason we respect our institutions, even when they falter," he said. "Without that respect, we have nothing but chaos." These voices, powerful and polished, called for civility, for caution, for a return to orderly discourse. They didn't deny that Dan Rather had made mistakes. They couldn't, but they insisted that calling him out, especially so publicly, especially so sharply, was an act of disrespect that would tear at the fragile threads still holding the country together. "It's not just about what she said," one panelist argued. "It's how she said it. The tone, the aggression, the lack of deference to experience." The word deference hung heavily in the air, and across the internet, millions knew exactly what it meant. Know your place. But on the other side, a new chorus rose up, louder, younger, hungrier. Reformers, activists, everyday citizens who had long felt invisible under the weight of tradition seized the moment with both hands. "Finally," tweeted a young journalist from Detroit, "finally someone said it. Experience without accountability is just arrogance." Viral TikTok stitched Jasmine's calm stare with images of marches, courtrooms, broken chains. On podcasts and YouTube live streams, new voices rose to drown out the old. Voices saying what had simmered for years in the corners of the American dream. That maybe it was time for the old kings and queens of truth to answer for the crowns they had been tarnished. They called Jasmine fearless. They called her necessary. "She didn't break the rules," one op-ed in the Washington Post thundered. "She exposed that the rules were already broken and had been for a very long time." In panel discussions across MSNBC, in editorials in The Atlantic, in late-night monologues that usually danced around politics but now couldn't help but dive headfirst, a new narrative took shape. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just survived the night. She had redefined it. Still, the clash between the two camps wasn't clean. It wasn't neat. It was ugly, brutal, fought not just over facts but over the soul of what America thought it was. Supporters of the old order posted grainy footage of Dan Rather reporting from war zones, standing in hurricane winds, anchoring elections through chaos, pleading for the country to remember his service. Reformers responded with clips of Rathergate, screenshots of discredited headlines, reminders that no amount of history could excuse the betrayal of trust. Cable news channels ran split screens. On one side, Jasmine's steely gaze. On the other, Dan Rather's grim, blinking face at the moment she delivered her blow. Analysts dissected every word, every breath, every micro-expression, as if trying to rewrite the meaning of what had already been burned into the public's memory. And in the comments sections, on call-in radio shows, at family dinner tables and late-night bars, the debate crackled like wildfire. Some argued that Jasmine was a symbol of the new arrogance, too quick to tear down, too proud to learn. Others said she was exactly what the moment demanded, a voice unafraid to speak the truth even when it made the room uncomfortable, even when it shattered the myth of infallibility that had kept so many systems unchallenged for so long. Memes flooded Facebook and Instagram. One showed a crumbling stone statue of a news anchor, shattered by a single tiny hammer labeled truth. Another showed Jasmine standing tall while old giants fell behind her, their armor rusted through from the inside. Even in political circles, the aftershocks were immediate. In private emails leaked to the press, Democratic strategists debated whether Jasmine's rise was a gift or a grenade. "She's electric," one advisor wrote, "but she scares the hell out of the donor class." Republican operatives circulated talking points labeling her divisive, disrespectful, dangerously radical, but some among them whispered a different fear. What if she was simply telling a truth they could no longer afford to deny? The country didn't know which side it was on yet. Maybe it never would. Maybe that was the point. But everywhere the air was charged with something rare and volatile, the feeling that a real choice was being forced into the light. In the days that followed, editorials battled each other on the front pages of America's biggest newspapers. One columnist declared Jasmine Crockett the harbinger of a cultural collapse. Another declared her the voice America's been waiting for. Talk radio exploded with furious debates. At churches and union halls and college campuses, conversations turned fiery and raw, dividing friends, families, generations. And all across it, Jasmine said nothing. She issued no follow-up statement. She did no victory lap. She didn't need to. The battle wasn't about her anymore. It was about the fault line she had revealed, the deep, jagged wound that had been there all along, just waiting for someone brave enough to point at it and say, "This is real. Now what are you going to do about it?" Across the country, old powers scrambled to reinforce their walls. New forces gathered outside those walls, stronger with every passing hour. It wasn't a polite argument. It wasn't a debate for television ratings. It was the sound of a country, cornered by its own history, trying to decide what parts of itself were still worth saving. And in the eye of that growing storm, Jasmine Crockett's words still echoed. The truth doesn't need permission. It just needs to be spoken. And once spoken, it could never be unsaid. And just when the fury seemed ready to swallow itself whole, a single unexpected voice rose above the noise, one the nation thought would never speak again. 1 week to the day after Jasmine Crockett's quiet earthquake, when the country was still raw and gasping from the aftershocks, an op-ed appeared on the Atlantic's front page. It didn't come with a press conference. It wasn't teased with dramatic headlines. It simply arrived, stark, simple, almost solemn, signed by Dan Rather himself. The title alone froze the news cycle. When the truth hurts, listen anyway. The piece didn't open with excuses. It didn't try to rewrite what had happened under the studio lights. Instead, Dan Rather wrote plainly, almost painfully, his words carrying the heavy ache of someone who had been forced to see himself without the soft filters of memory or pride. Last week, he began, I faced something that every person who ever called themselves a journalist should be willing to face. The truth, even when it cuts deep. He didn't name Jasmine in the first line, or the second. He didn't have to. Her presence hung over every word, every comma, like a silent witness to the reckoning. Rather described the moment without embellishment, the tension in the room, the silence after her words, the way the truth had pressed against him like a weight he could no longer ignore. And then, with a brutal honesty that few had expected him capable of, he wrote the sentence that would set the world alight once more. Jasmine Crockett gave me a painful but necessary lesson. The admission hit the political world like another shockwave, not because it was loud, but because it was unguarded. Rather didn't try to minimize her. He didn't belittle her youth, her generation, or her delivery. Instead, he did the one thing that no one had done all week. He listened. He described how he had spent decades believing that experience automatically made him right, that the passage of time itself justified his judgment. He spoke about the danger of mistaking tradition for truth and how hard it was, even now, to admit that sometimes the oldest voices need to be challenged by the youngest ones. Halfway through the piece, Dan Rather finally named her Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, and with it, the tone shifted from confession to something almost reverent. "We need more leaders like her," he wrote, "leaders who do not fear the truth, no matter how inconvenient it may be." His words, steady and precise, carried none of the defensiveness that had clouded his voice on that stage. Instead, they bore the clarity of a man who had finally, painfully, remembered what the real work of truth-telling demanded. He closed the piece not by defending his legacy, but by surrendering it to something bigger than himself. "The truth," he wrote, "does not belong to the old or the young. It belongs to the brave." The reaction was immediate, and unlike anything the country had seen in decades. Newsrooms that had spent the last week battling over whether Jasmine's challenge was a mistake or a revolution now found themselves stunned into silence. Cable news anchors fumbled for words, trying to reframe narratives that had calcified too quickly. Pundits who had scorned Jasmine now scrambled to walk their outrage back, their faces tight with the sour taste of being caught on the wrong side of history. On social media, the clip of Rather's confession was posted side by side with Jasmine's original takedown. TikTok creators stitched his words over footage of her sitting calmly under the studio lights, making the moment feel inevitable, as if the old world had been destined to bow to the new from the start. Hashtags like "Rather listens" and "Truth belongs to the brave" soared to the top of Twitter. Young activists wrote open letters thanking Rather not for agreeing with them, but for demonstrating that humility was still possible in an age drowning in pride. Even late-night comedians, who had feasted all week on the Rather vs. Crockett clash, paused to offer a rare note of respect. "You know," one said, shaking his head in mock amazement, "it's not often you see a giant fall and then get back up just to say, 'You were right.' That's a plot twist I didn't see coming." But not everyone cheered. Among the old guard, there were grumbles, whispered accusations that Rather had been bullied, that he had betrayed his own generation by admitting fault. Some editorials quietly urged maturity and perspective, warning against a future where experience was discarded at the first sign of discomfort. Yet even these voices seemed smaller now, more desperate. The tide had turned too visibly, too powerfully, and at the center of it, Jasmine Crockett still said nothing. She didn't hold a press conference. She didn't claim victory. She didn't ride the wave of validation with triumphant speeches. She simply kept doing her work day after day, letting the truth she had spoken, and the truth Dan Rather had finally acknowledged, do what truth always does when it is allowed to breathe: change everything it touches. In Washington, the shift was more than symbolic. Younger lawmakers, inspired by her example, grew bolder in committee rooms and hearings. Questions once swallowed out of politeness were now spoken plainly. Assumptions about who deserved automatic respect and who needed to earn it began to crumble. Staffers, long used to advising their bosses to play it safe, whispered among themselves about a new kind of politics rising from the ashes of the old. And across the country, people who had felt invisible for too long carried Jasmine's words with them like a small, secret flame. They repeated them quietly at kitchen tables, in classrooms, at protest marches. The truth doesn't need permission, it just needs to be spoken. Dan Rather's admission had not erased his mistakes. It hadn't wiped the slate clean, but it had done something almost more powerful. It had proven that even the oldest institutions could still choose humility over hubris. That courage wasn't the exclusive property of the young or the old, but belonged to anyone willing to face the brutal, necessary mirror of truth. And for the first time in a long, long time, America dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, something better was possible after all. The headlines were still burning hot across every television screen. The hashtags were still climbing, the clips still spinning through 1,000 apps, 1,000 edits, 1,000 loud, relentless conversations. But here in the marble corridors of the Capitol, none of that noise followed Jasmine Crockett. Here there was only silence. Her footsteps echoed sharply against the polished floor as she made her way down the long hallway, the sound oddly hollow in the grand, empty space. Security guards posted near the elevators nodded at her without a word. Staffers emerging from late-night meetings lowered their gazes, whispering after she passed, unsure whether to offer congratulations or apologies. Jasmine didn't stop. She didn't even glance at them. She just kept walking, the weight of the night pressing heavier on her shoulders with every step. When she reached the south wing, a part of the building nearly abandoned at this hour, she paused. A tall window framed the city outside, Washington, D.C., glittering under the bruised velvet of midnight skies. Streetlights flickered far below. Red and blue police strobes splashed against the pale stone of government buildings. And beyond them, hidden in the dark, the American people wrestled with the tremors she had sent through the ground. For a long moment, Jasmine just stood there. No cameras, no crowds, no flashing lights. Just her in the silence she had earned. Victory, she thought, didn't feel the way people imagined it would. It didn't come with music swelling under your feet. It didn't taste like champagne or smell like roses. It felt heavy. It felt raw. It felt like standing alone in the ruins of a house that everyone else had insisted wasn't burning. She leaned her forehead gently against the cool glass, closing her eyes. All week they had called her brave. All week they had posted memes, written op-eds, shouted her name in celebration or in fury. But none of those voices were here now. None of them could carry the cost she carried inside her ribcage. Speaking the truth wasn't the hard part. Living with what it destroyed, that was where the real weight lived. Her phone buzzed for the 100th time in her pocket. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. She knew what was waiting. Invitations to interviews, offers to write a book, urgent requests for her to headline rallies, fundraisers, causes she hadn't even heard of yet, opportunities. The vultures always came when the blood was fresh. But Jasmine wasn't interested in building a brand. She wasn't interested in becoming a symbol carefully managed and sold in pieces to a hungry public. She had spoken because she couldn't bear the silence anymore, and she knew deep in the marrow of her bones that the silence would always come back. It was part of the cycle. Noise, applause, outrage, and then nothing. She opened her eyes and stared down at the city again. How many others had stood in this place before her? How many had spoken the truth and watched the world roar in approval, only to find themselves abandoned when the next shiny controversy rolled across the headlines? She thought of Martin. She thought of Malcolm. She thought of every woman and man who had stood up when it was easier to kneel and paid the price in loneliness, not fame. You don't speak the truth because it's popular. You speak it because it's true. Jasmine straightened from the window and took a slow breath. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving her muscles aching, her mind heavy. She hadn't slept properly in days. She hadn't eaten much either. But she wasn't tired the way most people understood it. She was tired the way soldiers are tired after a battle they know is only the first of many. Her hand drifted toward the thin gold cross resting against her collarbone, a gift from her grandmother, given on a porch swing in the sweltering heat of a Texas summer. "This is your armor," her grandmother had said, fastening the chain with gnarled fingers. "Not because it will protect you, but because it will remind you who you are when the world tries to tell you otherwise." Jasmine smiled faintly at the memory, then let her hand fall. She didn't need armor tonight. Tonight she needed to remember why she had walked into the fire in the first place. Not for claps, not for votes, not even for history. She had spoken because she had to. Because if the truth had no place left in the halls of power, then it had no place left anywhere. And if speaking it meant standing alone, then so be it. She turned away from the window and walked slowly back down the corridor, her heels clicking steadily against the marble. Each step measured, deliberate, carrying the quiet gravity of someone who understood that the cost of doing the right thing wasn't temporary. It was a lifetime. As she passed an empty conference room, she caught a glimpse of herself in the dark glass. For a moment, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. Not because she looked broken, but because she looked changed, sharper, stronger, a little sadder. She paused, studying her own reflection. What they wouldn't understand, the panelists, the pundits, the trolls clicking furiously on their keyboards, was that this wasn't a game to her. It never had been. This wasn't about scoring points or delivering viral moments. It was about living in a way that would let her sleep at night. It was about standing straight in a world that bent itself to convenience. The words rang back in her mind, clean and fierce and unrepentant. No, she thought, it never has. The hallway stretched before her, endless and empty. The work ahead would be brutal. The blowback would come, sharper, uglier, more dangerous than anything the first wave had thrown. And she would face it alone, again and again. But Jasmine Crockett had already made her peace with that. She didn't need the crowd. She didn't need the applause. She didn't need the permission of a world too afraid to look itself in the eye. She had her voice. She had her truth. And no matter what storm came next, she would walk into it, steady and unbowed, one slow, quiet step at a time. While Jasmine Crockett walked the silent halls of power alone, the country she had challenged was not silent. It was alive. It was burning. Across every city, every suburb, every corner of America, where politics had once been a quiet background noise, battle lines were being drawn, not by party, not by race, not even by age, but by something far more volatile. The question of who still had the right to speak the truth and who had long ago forfeited it. In newsrooms, journalists gathered in tense, whispered meetings, their coffee cups forgotten on scratched wooden tables as they argued over what Jasmine's moment meant. Some leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, scowling. "You don't call out legends like that," they said. "You respect the people who came before you, even if they stumbled." Others, younger, sharper-eyed, leaned forward, their voices cutting sharper. When respect becomes silence, it stops being noble. It becomes complicity. At universities, debate halls overflowed with students arguing fiercely, sometimes at the edge of shoving matches. Professors used to coaxing polite discussions from weary classrooms found themselves refereeing battles they had no control over. Was Jasmine Crockett a necessary shock to a dying system, or an arrogant symptom of a generation too quick to tear down what they barely understood? No one agreed. No one was neutral. And for the first time in years, no one wanted to be. In corporate offices, CEOs and brand strategists huddled around crisis boards, whispering in urgent tones. The old playbook of staying quiet, staying safe, suddenly felt useless. The new energy Jasmine had unleashed wasn't polite, it wasn't predictable, and it wasn't going away. Political consultants on both sides scrambled to adapt. Democrats whispered about rebranding the party around authenticity. More Crockett, less polished speeches. One memo read. Republicans debated furiously behind closed doors. Should they attack her as a radical, or quietly try to siphon off her message of accountability for their own causes? Cable news hosts, once so confident in their roles as referees of public opinion, now struggled to keep up. Every night their panels grew louder, angrier, more chaotic. Every night Jasmine's face appeared again, sometimes praised, sometimes vilified, but always there, unignorable, an immovable center of gravity around which the old world spun itself dizzy trying to catch up. And the people, the ones who didn't have blue check marks next to their names, the ones who didn't host shows or write columns, felt the shift most deeply of all. They didn't always have the right words for it. They didn't always agree on every detail. But in bars, in beauty salons, in church basements and bus stops, a single feeling pulsed stronger with every conversation. Something had cracked. And no matter what came next, it wasn't going to be the same. Some felt hope, wild, fragile, electric. Some felt rage, raw and desperate, fighting to pull the old structures back into place before it was too late. But no one felt nothing. The old elite fought to reassert control. Editorials poured in like floodwater, carefully crafted essays from retired politicians, aging journalists, establishment voices urging caution, respect, moderation. We must not destroy our institutions out of impatience, they warned. Reform is good, revolution is dangerous. But for every polished plea for patience, There were 1,000 raw, furious responses from people who had waited their entire lives for someone to tell the truth without asking permission. They posted Jasmine's words in bold black letters across their timelines, across posters, across protest signs taped to the sides of buildings. The truth doesn't need permission, it just needs to be spoken. The movement wasn't organized, it wasn't funded, it wasn't planned by political consultants in glass towers. It was spontaneous, it was messy, and it was real. In the churches of Montgomery, Alabama, pastors wove Jasmine's stand into sermons about justice and courage. In coffee shops in Portland, artists painted murals of her, capturing her calm, unflinching gaze under storm-gray skies. In high school civics classes across Texas and Ohio and Georgia, teachers, some openly, some carefully, used clips of her confrontation as case studies in what civic courage could look like. Not everyone agreed with her. Not everyone liked her. But even those who hated what she stood for could not deny the shift she had forced. This was no longer just about one congresswoman facing down one legendary journalist. This was about America itself, about whether a nation built on the idea of truth could survive confronting the places where it had betrayed that idea. The divisions hardened quickly. On one side stood the guardians of tradition, those who insisted that experience, even when tarnished, must still be deferred to. On the other side stood the breakers of silence, those who believed that respect earned without accountability was no respect at all. It was not a clean war. Families fractured over it. Church congregations argued bitterly. City councils split down invisible, bitter lines. But underneath the noise, underneath the shouting, something colder and more permanent had begun to crystallize. The country was no longer debating whether truth mattered. It was debating whether comfort mattered more. And in that fight, Jasmine Crockett's moment lived on, not as a clip, not as a meme, but as a battle standard waving high above the noise, stubborn and unbreakable. Inside the Capitol, some of the old guard muttered that the storm would pass, that the country would forget, that people always forget. But outside the marble walls in streets and schools and bedrooms, lit by the cold glow of cell phone screens at 2 in the morning, the fire refused to die. Because Jasmine's real victory wasn't in the trending charts, it wasn't in the polls, it wasn't even in Dan Rather's reluctant admission. It was in the millions who, for the first time, realized they didn't need permission to speak the truth. And once awakened, that kind of power does not sleep again easily. But long after the headlines faded, long after the debates cooled, and the next scandal tried to steal the spotlight, something deeper remained, an unshakable lesson written in the quiet spaces between Jasmine Crockett's words. The true battle had never been about who won a single night under the hot lights of a television studio. It wasn't about trending hashtags or viral videos, or even the temporary shifting of public opinion. It was about something far older, far more dangerous, the idea that truth was not a luxury for the comfortable, but a weapon for the brave. Jasmine Crockett's stand reminded the world of something it had long tried to forget, that telling the truth will not make you popular. It will not shield you from attack. It will not guarantee applause or forgiveness or peace. Often it will do the opposite. It will cost you friendships. It will cost you safety. It will cost you comfort, and still it must be spoken. The human heart craves safety, craves belonging, craves the warmth of the tribe. But justice does not live in comfort. Progress does not bloom in polite silence. Truth does not survive when it is left to rot behind closed doors. It demands light. It demands risk. It demands people willing to carry its unbearable weight even when the crowd turns its back and walks away. In every era, it is easier to side with tradition, with experience, with the soothing reassurance of voices that say, "Trust me, I know better." And it is far harder, far lonelier, to sit in a room full of towering reputations and say, with steady hands and steady heart, "Experience without accountability is not wisdom, it is rot." The lesson wasn't about Dan Rather's legacy. It wasn't even about Jasmine Crockett's rise. It was about the price of truth and the rare, brutal kind of courage it takes to pay it. Because real courage doesn't look like grand speeches or sweeping applause. It looks like standing alone in the blistering light, knowing you will be misunderstood, knowing you will be attacked, knowing you will be left carrying the silence when everyone else has gone home, and doing it anyway. It is easy to tell the truth when it costs nothing. It is easy to be brave when you are certain the world will cheer for you afterward. But what Jasmine showed the world, the lesson carved into the marrow of her moment, was that the kind of truth that matters, the kind of truth that changes the world, almost always comes wrapped in discomfort, in sacrifice, in pain. It demands that you speak even when your voice shakes. It demands that you stand even when your legs are tired. It demands that you refuse to flinch even when the full weight of tradition, of power, of history itself leans against your chest, daring you to stay silent. And when you do, when you choose truth over comfort, when you choose to speak even when you are scared, you don't just change the conversation, you change the possible. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defeat an argument. She cracked open the walls that had kept too many silent for too long. She showed a country drunk on nostalgia that there is no future worth building on the bones of lies. She reminded a weary generation that change does not come with permission slips. It comes with pain, and it is worth it. So if there is a lesson to carry forward, it is this. Do not wait for the world to be ready for your truth. Do not wait for permission. Do not wait for comfort or consensus or the perfect moment. Speak when it matters, especially when it costs you something to do so. Because if enough people are brave enough to speak when silence feels safest, the world cannot help but shift under their feet. Jasmine Crockett stood in a room built to make her shrink, and she grew instead. She stood under lights meant to expose her weaknesses and showed them her strength. She spoke the truth not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. And in doing so, she left behind a blueprint for every soul who has ever stood trembling before a system that said, "Sit down, stay quiet, wait your turn." Her answer, the answer that burned itself into the heart of America, was clear. The truth doesn't need permission. It just needs to be spoken. And that truth, once spoken, can never be undone. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.